Chapter 3. Crisis of Confession. Junon, Zack thought, was all burnished bronze and golden brown, unlike Midgar. The warm colours of the city could make you forget it was essentially a giant weapon and fortress. Shinra's Junon branch office wasn't much different from the main headquarters in Midgar. Smaller, of course, much smaller, but not exactly different. There was still a lot of pretension. Zack eyeballed the huge desk at the far end of the room, before letting his attention wander to the large space's sole occupant, the very man he'd come looking for. In a space of warm tones that not even industrial steel could destroy, Sephiroth stood out like a bandersnatch among a group of jumpings. He was leaning against one of the rectangular steel desks, his back to the large screens taking up the left wall. The glow reflected off his hair, dyeing it patchy colours of pink and gold, as information flickered across them. Zack headed towards him, stopping only to grab a chair from another desk and drag it across the floor so he could position it near Sephiroth. He spun it around, then straddled it and crossed his arms over his back. Sephiroth didn't even look up from the sheet of paper his attention was apparently devoted to. Zack wondered if Sephiroth did that to look busy so people would leave him alone. The silence held, accented only by the occasional grinding of the computer, or the hiss of its cooling fans as Zack waited for Sephiroth to acknowledge him. When it became clear he wasn't going to, he locked his boots around the legs of his chair and said, "So..." Sephiroth didn't even glance up. "We haven't spoken in a while, so I thought I'd come see how you were doing. Maybe have a chat?" Sephiroth looked up at last, and Zack put on a hopeful smile. Maybe his lead-in had worked. His smile turned wry when Sephiroth glanced back to the paper, though he did speak. "Don't you have things to do?" Zack wilted slightly under the faint reprimand, and ran his hand over his hair. He paused and brought it back around to look at his bare palm. He hadn't even replaced his gloves yet. "Nah, I took care of everything that I can." To demonstrate, he held his hands up, and began to tick points off on his fingers. "Got the injured man into the hands of the medical staff, made sure everyone else was assigned rooms for the night, called Lazard to give him a preliminary report, and was ordered to report to him as soon as I get back to Midgar. Tried to get one stubborn idiot to go to the medics and failed spectacularly. Gave up and came to find you." Sephiroth was actually watching him over the top of the paper he was holding now. "The one who attacked me?" Zack did a double take at the question, and dragged his attention away from the rather nice view of the ocean out the massive windows. The sun reflecting off it was rather dazzling. "Oh, yeah, that's the one. I'm not sure why, but he adamantly refuses to get seen. I figure it might be the Mako still making him jittery, so I laid off. Hopefully he'll calm down and I can get him to get a checkup." Sephiroth's intense scrutiny was weird, and Zack held his hands up as if to ward off further reprimand. "I made sure the guys who bunked down with him will keep an eye on him. A couple of them are soldiers, so they know what to watch for." Their conversation, if you could call it that, was interrupted by the quiet tap-tap of shoes on the floor. Zack glanced over at the same time Sephiroth did to see Tseng walking towards them. The Turk looked as impassive as ever, his suit not even the least bit rumpled. Zack kind of envied him for that for a moment, until his phone beeped. When it was obvious that Tseng was here to talk to Sephiroth, he fished his phone out, one ear tuned in to the conversation beside him. He wasn't eavesdropping if they were talking right in front of him, and knew he was there, after all. "You'll be able to return to Midgar soon." Tseng's conversational tone made Zack glance up from his phone in curiosity. Sephiroth, it seemed, had gone back to studying that paper in his hands. Zack took a moment to wonder where it had come from, and what it was even about. "Is that so?" Sephiroth's voice startled Zack out of his contemplations, and he looked back down at his phone. The time caught his attention, and only made him feel more tired. Zack barely contained a groan. Only around 1500 hours Midgar standard, and Junon's an hour behind. To distract himself, he opened his inbox to check out the message he had received. Zack wasn't surprised to find it was from Kunzel. "Yes, the arrival of the scientists is imminent," Tseng said. His shoes scuffed ever so slightly against the floor as he turned to go. Then he paused. Zack looked up again at the uncharacteristic hesitation. I hear that this account has caused a great deal of attention. I see, Sephiroth murmured. Zack turned his attention back to him just as Sephiroth turned and set the paper he'd been holding down on the desk. As Sephiroth swept past Zeng, he added, "Inform Director Lazard that I'll take some of the men to deal with the infestation at the Mithril mines. It will do them good after such a demoralizing affair. Zack, come with me." Startled at the order, Zack knocked the chair over in his hurry to follow Sephiroth. "What? Why?" Zack asked. He hurriedly set the chair back up, scrambling after the man, and left behind a very bemused Zeng. "What's going on, Sephiroth?" Sephiroth didn't respond, merely cut across the room and out the door onto the landing beyond. Zack followed after him, feeling a bit sulky, and turned his attention to his phone, still in his hand. Sephiroth would probably tell him in due time. His boots clanged heavily on the metal stairway as he followed Sephiroth down it, and Zack was mildly envious of the ways Sephiroth's steps didn't seem quite as heavy. Then again, Sephiroth wasn't carrying a sword that probably weighed as much, if not more than he did. In fact, he didn't appear to have Masamune on him at all. Zack finally opened the mail as he hit the landing on the first floor. "A bunch of scientists just left in several helicopters. I heard that Hojo was among them. I wonder what's so interesting to get that guy out of his labs." Zack frowned at the news, then thought back on the conversation he'd just heard. Zeng had mentioned scientists arriving, and then Sephiroth had flown into motion. He paused on the last stair of the second staircase to stick his phone back into his pocket. Sephiroth didn't pause to wait for him as he cut across the room and past the statue at its center. Zack jogged after him even as he made a mental note to tell Kunzel he needed to get a date. His friend was really too involved in his gossip collecting. There were people loitering down here, unlike the branch office's second floor, and several of them were stopping to gawk at Sephiroth as he prowled past them in a swirl of silver hair and black leather. Zack dodged them until he fell into step with the man. "Sephiroth, where are we going?" He wanted to ask if this had anything to do with Hojo. Angeal had said that Sephiroth didn't like the man when Genesis had attacked the Shinra building earlier in the year. But wasn't this a bit much? "To collect our team," Sephiroth replied. Zack just felt more bewildered, but decided to follow along regardless. Obviously the man was up to something, even if Zack couldn't tell what. Lying on the stiff, military-issue bunk in the dark, Cloud listened to the rustle of cloth as someone rolled over on their own bed. The soldiers from the aborted mission had all been instructed to retire and recover, despite the early hour. Not that Cloud was sleeping. He stared sightlessly at the ceiling as he let his mind wander and his body recover. It was odd. Despite being dumped summarily in the past, Cloud didn't feel much different. He'd seen his face in a passing mirror. Younger, his hair a wild frizz on his head from the grime and slime it had been subjected to, but still with the familiar Mako glow to his eyes. Surreptitious observation led him to believe that he was depressingly even shorter now than he'd been in the future, though only by an inch or two. Other than that, he felt perfectly normal. Even his strength was the same as before, and he knew that, logically, that shouldn't be so. Either he should have looked older, which would have brought a wealth of questions Cloud did not want to answer, or he should have been, as he was years ago, a normal trooper. His body still twinged occasionally, leading him to believe the ache and muscle pains he'd experienced were connected to the amalgam of his younger and older self. Cloud pulled his mind away from those disorientating thoughts and considered what had happened after he'd realized that Zack was real and not some sort of Mako dream. While he hadn't quite blacked out on the battlefield, he had pretty much been useless after he'd managed to stop his hysterical laughter. The adrenaline that had kept him upright up until then had run out, and his body had paid the toll. He'd been a shaky mess, unable to even walk on his own, but at least his head had finally cleared from the confusion it had suffered from his impromptu Mako bath. The helicopter ride back to Junon had been torture, however. Zack had insisted he ride with him in the smaller chopper, while the rest of the surviving troops had bundled up into the larger vehicles designed to transport them and their equipment. The worst part was that Cloud was stuck in close confinement with not only a hyperactively worried Zack, but also Sephiroth, Singh, and a much younger Reno as pilot. Cloud wondered if his ghosts had to haunt him, if they couldn't find better company next time. As they left the area, they had passed an incoming helicopter, which Singh had informed them, or Zack and Sephiroth presumably, and him just by circumstance, that it was full of soldier seconds who would take care of cleanup of the battlefield. Cloud spent the next few hours bemusedly responding to Zack's queries about his health, mostly with a monosyllabic fine. It was slightly amusing how many times Zack had asked him if he was feeling airsick, though. The badgering had stopped when Reno lost his temper and threatened to crash the helicopter if Zack didn't shut up for 5 minutes. Singh hadn't reprimanded the outburst, leading Cloud to believe that he was also tired of Zack's unending energy. It was surreal for Cloud to observe the patience Sephiroth had, and he'd been sure he saw just the hint of an amused smile at one point. The nerve-wracking flight had finally ended when they landed in Junon, and Sephiroth and Singh had taken off almost immediately. Zack stuck with Cloud, seeming to be intent on dragging him to the nearest medical facility. Cloud had resisted, not wanting to have anything to do with doctors ever again. He'd won the argument, mostly because he did seem to be fine on his feet now, having had time to recover on the trip over. Zack had trailed after him when he rejoined the troops, swiftly taking command and ordering the lot of them into the local barracks to rest and recover. Cloud had been bunked with 5 others, 3 regular troopers and 2 of the soldiers, who he learned were rookie thirds. In all the confusion, no one had worried about rank or division, just at finding a place to crash for a few hours as the higher-ups regrouped. It had been a surprise when the 5 had immediately volunteered to watch over him in response to Zack's query. He recognized a couple of the faces from the last fight among the monsters, so it was odd that they were so eager to be in his presence still. Cloud would have thought they'd have been scared off. Hey Cloud, you awake?" A quiet voice drifted through the dim room from the bunk above him, and interrupted his musings abruptly. Cloud raised an eyebrow in the darkness as, around him, a sudden concentration of attention focused in his direction. Obviously, his bunkmate wasn't the only one still awake. "Yeah," he finally answered, equally quiet. It had been a long time since strangers had attempted to talk to him. The only human contact he really had was his friends, and sometimes the orphans. Other people were just incidental, who were forgotten the moment they were out of sight. "You, doing okay?" his bunkmate asked tremulously. He sounded unsure of what to say, and Cloud didn't blame him. To their view, Cloud must have seemed to have gone completely insane, not an uncommon occurrence due to mako poisoning. Cloud pondered for a moment if he should even bother answering the question. The opportunity was lost when another voice piped up from across the room. "You must have been insane," came a low, excited voice. You went toe-to-toe with the general. I mean, has anyone ever seen him up close like that before?" "I have," came a third voice. "He was there during our advancement. Damned impressive to look at, but hell if anyone could tell what he's thinking." "I think he looked bored," came yet another voice. Cloud absently ticked off the numbers in his head, trying to match the voices to the half-remembered faces of his companions. "All he had to do was stand there looking official. It was Director Lazard that did all the talking. The guy could inspire rocks to get up and march, I swear." "Is Soldier all that different?" the second voice asked, eagerness lacing his tone. "It's hard to get into, but, is it worth all the hype it gets?" "If you survive the mako, you mean?" the first soldier asked bitingly. Cloud noted the hostility there, wondering if maybe the man had had to deal with Hojo up close and personal. He wouldn't blame anyone for hating that poor excuse of a human being. "Stop scaring the grunts, Edge," the other soldier reprimanded. "Soldier isn't too much different. You get sent on the harder assignments, have more responsibility, and are expected to bring back perfect results. The rumor is, if you don't fulfill your missions to the exact order, you get sent to the general to explain exactly what went wrong. Now who's scaring the grunts? The first soldier muttered. I think I'd rather stick with the regular army, Cloud's bunkmate said wistfully. I mean, you have everything you need, and if things go wrong, it's the officer's problem to take care of it. Well, except when things like today happen, I guess. Do you think you're going to come back to our squad, Cloud? Or do you think the scientists are going to want to check you out? Make sure the Mako didn't do any damage? Cloud started when he realized the comment was directed at him. He frowned in the dark. I won't go to the scientists, he said, voice quiet and firm. That, at least, he was sure of. He didn't answer the question completely, unsure at the moment what he planned to do. If he stayed in the regular army, he would eventually be assigned to the Nibelheim mission, and from there he could attempt to destroy Genova before she had a chance to get her claws into Sephiroth's mind. On the other hand, there was no guarantee that such a plan would work. Cloud couldn't say for sure when Sephiroth had stepped over the edge of madness, and waiting that long would be a dangerous move. If he left now, deserted the army and returned to Nibelheim first, there was a chance he could get to her before Sephiroth even came near. That was assuming that Sephiroth wouldn't go mad anyway, and Cloud would have to leave Zack behind, unaware of the danger he was in. The uncomfortable silence his statement had left was broken when the room was suddenly flooded with light, spilling in from the open doorway. 2 figures were silhouetted, but Cloud didn't even have to look to recognize that at least one of them was Sephiroth. The Genova cells in him resonated still. He climbed out of bed a bit more slowly than the others, who had scrambled madly to attention the second they realized an officer was present. Cloud had tried not to crack a smile at how they tried to look dignified and add attention in their undershirts, faces tight when they realized exactly who had come to call. He turned his gaze on his longtime enemy and current enigma in his life. It was times like this that he missed First Tsurugi the most. Sephiroth paced into the room, leaving a rather bewildered-looking Zack lurking in the doorway. The 6 of you are going to accompany Soldier Fair and I to deal with an infestation in the Mithril mines, he said shortly, voice precise and to the point. What? Yelped Zack. But, Sephiroth, shouldn't we at least wait until morning and make sure they have their gear? Sephiroth said, cutting him off, then swept out as quickly as he'd come. The barracks was frozen, no one willing to even breathe after the whirlwind of chaos that had just swept through. Cloud certainly felt unbalanced. It was beyond disturbing, but he found that he was missing Sephiroth's attention, too thrown when the man all but ignored him. Too many years had passed, where Cloud was the sole focus of that insane, cat-like green gaze. And now there was nothing. He didn't even think Sephiroth had said a single word to him directly. The thirds were the first to move, efficiently collecting their gear and beginning to dress. That sent the troopers to scrambling as well. When the general gave an order, you didn't question it, after all. Cloud felt more out of place than ever, standing there half-dressed and alone. He probably should pull on his oversized uniform he'd tossed in a corner of the bed. But Zack was standing there in the doorway, gaze fixed on the empty hallway Sephiroth had disappeared down. He took a hesitant step towards his friend, just in time to hear Zack mutter, "What's up with that guy?" Then Zack snorted and laughed. "Maybe he's running away." Cloud wasn't sure how it was supposed to be funny. Running away and Sephiroth didn't mesh in his mind. Maybe it was irony? Cloud's atrophied sense of humor couldn't keep up with Zack's mind. Cloud hadn't voluntarily talked to someone in quite a while, but he was determined to spend every moment he could talking to his friend, or at least listening. It was too good, too unbelievable still, that he could speak to Zack, that he was alive and well. So instead of turning around and joining the others, most of whom were already nearly ready in their military efficiency, Cloud took another step towards Zack, unsure how to even begin chatting. Hi, Zack?" He felt his face heat up a bit at the awkwardness, and hoped that the flush wasn't obvious on his face. Forget being inconspicuous. Cloud already knew he'd never be able to blend in with the troopers anymore. He couldn't remember a fraction of military rules and regulations, and he didn't think he'd be able to show the proper military deference to Zack, let alone other superior-ranked officers. He doubted he could even recognize a superior officer. If he hadn't already, Zack was sure to catch on to Cloud's odd behavior. Now all Cloud had to do was decide how to handle that. Zack turned, crooked grin in place, and raised a hand in a strange, abortive motion towards his hair. Instead, he rubbed at the back of his neck. "Hey, Cloud," he greeted. "You still feeling okay this morning?" Zack leaned in towards him, eyes roaming his face as if to see if he was looking at all ill. Before Cloud could say a word, he breezed on. "Well, no matter. You look all right, I guess. You better get dressed so we can get over to the equipment lockers and get you a uniform that's closer to your size, and find you some gear. If we don't get to the lift right on time, Sephiroth will probably leave us here and hoof it to Midgar on his own." He clapped Cloud on the shoulder, gave a little wave, and quit the room. Once again, Cloud was struck by the disjointed sensation that the entire world had gone insane. Zack had breezed out of the room without so much as a second pause, leaving Cloud feeling slightly snubbed again. He mentally kicked himself for the selfish thought. No matter how much he wished it, Zack had other things to worry about than one messed-up trooper, and he wasn't acting unkind, just preoccupied. Cloud had to remember that he was a nobody at this point, just an ordinary, low-class military grunt. "Can you believe this? A mission with the General!" One of the troopers breathed in an awestruck tone. Cloud absently made a mental note to learn their names at least, since he was stuck with them for the unforeseeable future. He did finally turn around and stride back to his bunk, where he dressed mechanically and listened with one ear to the gossiping troopers. They seemed content to wait for him to finish. "Fucking hell," one of the thirds said, running a nervous hand through his hair. "I don't know if we're just lucky or if we should start writing our wills now. The General. Fuck." "Just think of it as a promotion opportunity, Gibbs," the other third said, grinning as he lounged against the bedpost. Cloud thought he recalled the man's name was Edge. "But then why were we picked?" Cloud's bunkmate asked worriedly. "I mean, we're not even soldiers." "Don't be stupid. Why do you think we were picked?" one of the troopers said scathingly, giving Cloud a pointed look. "I bet the General is just curious as everyone else about the trooper who had the balls to go sword to sword with him." Cloud raised a noncommittal eyebrow, not apologetic in the least for his actions. While they probably would turn into trouble further along the line, Cloud would rather attack a completely innocent, a thought his mind choked on, Sephiroth, by mistake, than let the insane one have a moment to wreak havoc on the world again. "That was just the Mako," another trooper said. "Cloud's been in my team for several months, and we'd have noticed something odd before now. Right, Cloud?" Yeah," he responded, uncomfortably aware that his younger self would have known the other man's name, and that he had no clue how he was supposed to act. Was he friends with the guy? More likely they rarely talked. Cloud didn't remember much of his Shinra grunt days, but he remembered he'd been focused single-mindedly on getting into soldier, or his failure to. "Shouldn't we get going? The General gave us 20 minutes, he said, hoping the distraction would get their attention off him and any oddities he was exuding. "Oh shit, yeah! Move it, Jack!" the third trooper said, shoving the nearest man in the shoulder towards the door. "I'm not going to miss out on this opportunity because you wanted to gossip like an old washerwoman." "So what does that make us?" Edge asked caustically, Mako eyes narrowing at the trooper. There seemed to be no menace behind the action, something the trooper also picked up on. "That makes you head washerwoman, sir," the trooper said, saluting with a cocky grin. The poor joke was met with more laughter than it probably deserved, nerves running tight through everyone and making them giddy and reckless. Cloud fell in silently behind Edge, and the trooper, the other three marching out the door behind him. To everyone's surprise, judging by the cut-off exclamation from Jack, Zack was leaning against the wall right outside the door. Cloud's attention was immediately captured again by his old friend. Zach's expression was serious and thoughtful, as if he were deep in thought. The company pulled together in a salute, and Cloud hastily copied the action. "Sir," Edge said, standing at attention, "we were just on our way to the rendezvous point." The serious look that had been on Zach's face moments ago disappeared as he cracked a grin and pushed away from the wall. "At ease, men," he quipped, in what sounded to Cloud as a poor, joking imitation of Sephiroth's sharper tones. Zach looked them over in a brief inspection, pacing back and forth before them, and clearly not too concerned. When he stopped in the middle of the hall, he propped his hands on his hips. "Well, everything looks good to me. If you need anything, go get it. If not, go rendezvous, and you can gossip to your heart's content. For example, I heard that the scientists are arriving already. Apparently the rookies this year made a big first impression." Then his attention was on Cloud. Cloud felt oddly breathless as he met Zach's eyes, somehow worried it would all fade away. The moment, no longer than a second, was broken as Zach said, "Cloud, you're with me." There were a few flashes of embarrassment among the men, even as they saluted and headed off. Zach reached out and grabbed hold of Cloud's upper arm and began to tug him after them, down the short flight of stairs in the multi-story building, until they emerged out into Junon's streets. The other men were already well ahead of them in their rush, a few scattering off in other directions, most likely in search of things they were missing from their gear. Zach was a whirlwind of energy, not giving Cloud time to gather his thoughts as he was swept up in his wake. Zach didn't let him go, even as he turned a corner, leaving the other men to proceed to the airport themselves. Not that Cloud wanted to go anywhere else. "It was a good thing Sephiroth reminded me that you didn't have any equipment, or it might have gotten lost in the shuffle. By the way, I've been wondering..." Zach cut off as an officer rounded the corner, and Cloud could only watch in bemusement as he shifted closer to him until the man was gone. Was there a reason he was mistrustful of Shinra? Cloud knew there was every reason for that, but what had set Zach off? Cloud had no desire to stand out anyway. At least, once he decided what he was supposed to do with this second chance. Stop Sephiroth and don't let Zach and Aerith die was all well and good, but not much of a plan, he had to admit. "Anyway, I was wondering, where did you learn to use a sword like that? That wasn't regular infantry skills." Cloud barely controlled a flinch. "I stole your memories and copied your sword technique. I learned the basics from a friend," he managed to mumble out. Before he could get too mired in bitter thoughts, Zach drew him out again. "Ah, here we are." Cloud allowed himself to be manhandled into the supply room, where Zach immediately began banging around the lockers and lobbing equipment at him. He frowned, unhappy that he was once again forced to work for Shinra, even in a minor capacity. He changed quickly, knowing their time here was limited, and not wanting to do anything to get Zach in trouble with Sephiroth. "That work?" Zach asked after a brief moment. Cloud gave a non-committal grunt of acknowledgement. The clothes did fit, so much as regulation clothes could. Movement made him glance up to see Zach step to the wall that bore a rack of rifles. Once Zach had selected one, he turned and straddled one of the benches set in the middle of the room and began checking it over. Cloud went back to staring distastefully at the helmet in his hands. He very nearly stopped breathing when Zach spoke again. "Hey, Cloud? I know we haven't known each other very long, but you know if you need help, you can talk to me. We're friends, right?" The helmet slipped from Cloud's suddenly numb fingers. The hollow thunk of it hitting the floor rang loudly in the empty room. "We're friends, right?" Of all the things Cloud wished he could both remember and forget, that line cut straight into his heart. Zach, who had sacrificed so much for him, yet still was able to call him friend. Now he was right there, staring with earnest blue eyes at Cloud, as if the statement was a simple fact. Cloud ducked his head, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He quickly scooped up his fallen helmet, using the motion to compose himself. He had a terrible urge to run away, just take off into the wilderness where he could be alone and not have to worry about disappointing his loved ones. Cloud gave himself a mental shake and slipped the helmet on over his head to hide his expression. If he kept this up, nothing would change. "I like to think so," he said, voice muffled by his scarf. "If it's a bother, I can stop." He didn't think that was what Zack had meant, but with his non-existent social skills, he didn't want to miss a cue that was obvious to everyone else. Zack looked down at the rifle he held and switched the safety on before standing and holding it out to Cloud. The look Zack was giving him was serious until he cracked an easy smile. "Good. That means we watch each other's backs, all right? You had mine in Modierheim with Hollander, and I've got yours now." Cloud took the rifle absently, more focused on Zack's words and the emotions plainly displayed on his face. There was no doubt that Zack knew something was up. Cloud just had no idea what to say to reassure him, or, alternatively, if he should just tell Zack everything now and get it over with. Logically, there was no reason not to tell him, except that he might brand Cloud as clinically insane, that is. He was relieved that Zack had dismissed Cloud's hesitancy without comment, instead reassuring him that despite it all, Zack was Zack, and still considered him a friend. Cloud wasn't exactly sure what Modierheim had to do with anything, but he did vaguely remember an old town of that name. The holes in his memories were becoming worrisome. He'd always known they were there, but until now he hadn't realized just how prolific they were. Zack's words dispelled some of the doubt and worry, and Cloud knew that even if he did screw up, he would still be there to support him. It was a nice feeling, familiar in that it was what Tifa had been trying to pound through his skull for years. Cloud started slightly as Zack's hand plunked down on top of his helmeted head, and his friend leaned in closer. "And do me a favor and keep that on unless you're sure of your privacy and who you're with." The blatant worry Zack expressed set Cloud's nerves on end. There was some reason his friend didn't want Cloud's face to be seen, or possibly recognized. Perhaps his inadvertent fight with Sephiroth had already caused shockwaves throughout Shinra. The man had been untouchable before his fall, and Cloud doubted Hojo would take kindly to anyone challenging that pedestal. A chill ran down his back at the thought of being subjected to Hojo's curiosity. Never again. Zack stepped back and clenched one hand into a fist. "All right, so you ready to go face Sephiroth? Excited? Nervous?" Zack's laugh was bright and easy. "I don't think you'll have to worry too much so long as you don't attack him again. I was so surprised when I saw that. I mean, Cloud, you were handling yourself really well out there." Zack's sudden switch from seriousness to humor was jarring, and Cloud welcomed the change of pace. Not so much the subject he chose, though Cloud was willing to tell Zack anything he wanted to know, even if it got him in trouble later. There was no way he could bring himself to lie to his friend, when he knew Zack could and would sacrifice anything for Cloud. "Kinda nervous, I guess," he said hesitantly. "I didn't realize that, the General was there to help. Sorry for the trouble." He trailed off. How to address his sudden ability to take on Sephiroth one-on-one, though? Maybe if he didn't say anything, Zack would fill in his own explanation. That would have to do for now. Zack waved a hand absently through the air as he led Cloud out of the room with an amused look. "I wouldn't worry about it too much. You were in the middle of a pretty nasty fight, and had just had a close encounter with some Mako. That's enough to make anyone lose their head." Cloud blinked at the reminder. It was so odd, but with everything else running through his head, clamoring for attention, he had nearly forgotten his recent Mako bath. With some luck, that would explain away many of the oddities he'd acquired. At least long enough for Cloud to figure out how to fit in better. Trust Zack to come up with a solution to Cloud's problem, even if he wasn't aware he was doing so. "On the bright side," Zack carried on blithely, "it got Sephiroth out of the Shinra building. I haven't seen him since Modierheim. Nearly a year, come to think of it." That sent a foreboding chill down Cloud's spine. It was quickly becoming a familiar sensation, and one he didn't like at all. If Sephiroth was already withdrawing into himself, that was dangerous. It had only taken a few days in Nibelheim for Sephiroth to completely lose it. Who knew what he was reading, whether Hojo was planting false or adjusted information, and what sort of conclusions Sephiroth was coming to? Perhaps preventing his collapse into madness was as simple as removing Hojo from the equation. It was a pleasant thought. Cloud vowed to test the validity of that hypothesis. Zack didn't seem to require any input from Cloud as they strode down the hallways, and sent him a crooked grin, his head tilted in vague self-mockery. Apparently I'm just not good enough company. The comment did make Cloud give the bear a grin. He couldn't see anyone not appreciating Zack's company when put like that. As Zack fell silent, Cloud didn't bother trying to start up another conversation. He had no idea where to start, and there wasn't anything to say right now. They were short on time anyway, having already missed the 20-minute deadline, and hurrying through Shinra-infested halls was hardly the place for any heartfelt talks. They soon emerged into the bright afternoon sunlight of Junon's airport. Sephiroth was waiting with the other soldiers beside the large lift, a sheathed Masamune held in one hand. Cloud couldn't help a nervous jerk as his hand reached for a sword that wasn't there, or rather, was strapped to Zack's back at the moment. He tightened his grip on the strap of the gun hanging over his shoulder, wishing that he'd been allowed any sort of blade instead. Beside him, Zack piped up.
Sorry we're late, Sephiroth, but I did as you told me and made sure Cloud here was fully outfitted.
He held a hand out as if to present him to Sephiroth, a thought that made Cloud feel faintly ill.
I'm sure you're eager to get at those monsters. Me? I'd rather just get back to Midgar as soon as possible.
Sephiroth turned away from them, his long silver hair swishing with the motion, and strode off onto the lift. His voice floated back to them.
Be careful, or someone might get the idea that you botched the mission on purpose.
Cloud nearly dropped his rifle entirely, eyes wide behind the concealed visor, when he realized that Sephiroth, the great general and planetary nemesis, was teasing Zack. Cloud knew that Sephiroth couldn't have been a monster from birth, and he didn't go around skewering random people on Masamune. Much. It didn't stop the shock of seeing it in person. Strangely, Cloud felt ashamed for his thoughts. Despite the psychological and physical torture he'd suffered from the man in the past, Sephiroth had not yet done anything to deserve his ire. Wasn't the whole point of a second chance that everyone could be saved? Was it possible that even Sephiroth had a future other than madness? A hand tugged at his sleeve, and he jerked his arm loose before common sense reasserted itself. It was just one of the troopers, the one who had supposedly been on Cloud's team before. He didn't seem offended by Cloud's brush-off, just jerking his head for Cloud to fall in with the rest of the troops. Shaken, Cloud did so, sliding into place between Gibbs and another still nameless trooper in line where a gap had been left for him. Cloud nearly crawled right out of his skin when Sephiroth's feral green gaze swept over them. Sephiroth's words weren't any more calming than his gaze.
If you're all prepared.
It was obvious that it was not a question so much as a demand, an order. That they all better be prepared, or they'd live to regret it.
Some little monsters in the mines aren't going to overwhelm us,
Zack said cheerfully.
Let's go get 'em.
The nameless trooper beside him muttered,
Speak for yourself, sir.
Under Zack's hand on the lift controls, they were borne upward to get a glimpse of the helicopter idling nearby. Afternoon sunlight glittered off its sleek, dark metal curves and the heavy belly. The side door already stood open, showing the interior, though the pilot and co-pilot were already ensconced behind the controls. Cloud suspected that this was where Sephiroth had disappeared to. There was no way they'd have been ready and waiting otherwise.
I hate flying,
he heard an acidic voice mutter. A glance over one shoulder showed that one of the thirds, Edge, was looking a little pale under his helmet. The other third, Gibbs, clapped him roughly on the shoulder and made for the helicopter, ducking low to pass under the slowly spinning rotors. A heavy feeling of trepidation settled on Cloud's stomach as he trotted over with the others. He wasn't looking forward to being cramped inside another helicopter with Sephiroth so close by, and it was cramped. The helicopter might have been one of Shinra's models, made specifically for transporting squadrons, but with the addition of Masamune and Buster Sword, it was a near thing. No one complained, though. In fact, no one said a word. Even Zack was quiet as they left Junon behind. Cloud wondered if Zack had gotten any sleep last night, though he looked fresh enough. That could just be the Mako talking, as Cloud knew well. The other troopers looked like they wanted to nod off, but appeared to be too hyped up and uneasy to fall asleep in Sephiroth's presence. Cloud kept his gaze on his knees, aware that Sephiroth would probably feel it if he looked directly at him. It was hard to contain his curiosity at the enigma the man presented. There was still Cloud's knee-jerk reaction of reaching for a weapon every time Sephiroth made a more sudden than usual movement. Other than that, it was as if Cloud's presence was of no consequence at all to the man. Sephiroth acted quite normally, as far as Cloud could tell. If he was abrasive when he spoke, it was because he was giving orders to his subordinates. When he spoke to Zack, Cloud could hear something in his voice. Not exactly humor, but a vibrancy that Cloud had no memory of. The sheer absurdity of it made Cloud want to stare. He had to wonder what Sephiroth was thinking, now there were no other distractions. Cloud could feel the hum and buzz of the Genova cells in him reacting to the presence of the man. Cloud had been designed to serve Sephiroth, and take his place if ever something happened to the original. Hojo called him a failure, but there was still a connection that Cloud loathed every time he came face to face with his nemesis. The connection still hummed under his skin, yet wasn't the overwhelming sensation he was used to. Despite his racing thoughts, the silence and his fatigue slowly lulled Cloud's mind into a blissful state of blankness. The only noise seemed to be the white noise buzz of the Genova cells in the back of his mind. By the time he roused himself from his mind-numb state, to try and stretch the kinks out of his stiff arms, a few hours had gone by. A sudden lurch made his stomach flip uncomfortably in what might have been a residual effect of the motion sickness that he hadn't really dealt with in years, or could have been a reaction to Sephiroth's sudden movement. Cloud couldn't help but focus on him, and was relieved and baffled when the man yanked the helicopter's door open, even as it bumped down on the ground. A second later, Sephiroth vanished out the door in a swirl of silver hair. Zack was out next, followed closely by Edge, who shoved his way to the front of the scramble to exit. Cloud followed more slowly, his muscles more stiff and sore than he expected. The other three troopers had stopped once they were out from under the rotors to stretch tired and cramped muscles. Sephiroth and Zack weren't much further off. In fact, they were close enough for the wind from the rotor blades to buffet Sephiroth's hair and long coat. Cloud jerked his attention elsewhere as Sephiroth's gaze travelled briefly in his direction. A surreptitious glance back a second later showed that the man had been distracted by something Zack was saying. Relieved, though he knew it had nothing to do with him, Cloud took in his surroundings. They were situated at a relatively flat expanse of grass, near where the rough incline up to the mines began. Not too far off, a fairly disused-looking dirt road was visible. Behind him, the helicopter's engines whined as it lifted off again to head back to Junon.
"You're looking peaky,"
a coy voice crooned. Cloud glanced over to see one of the troopers flashing one of the thirds a toothy grin that was stark and bright against the dark color of his skin.
"I think you've got your helmet on backwards, Grunt," Edge growled. "It's not covering the gaping noisemaker you call a mouth."
Before the trooper could respond, Zack's voice cut clearly through the air.
"Hey, it could be worse. We could have made you jump out of the chopper."
Edge immediately paled a shade further, one that looked an ashen, sickly hue. Zack thumped his back as he walked past him.
"Better get used to it, man. It's one of the things you'll be expected to do as a soldier, without a parachute."
Cloud didn't know if that was true or not, though judging by Edge's expression, it probably was. A second later, Zack's eyes were on Cloud, and his friend was walking right towards him. Before he knew it, Zack was right in his face again as he attempted to peer through Cloud's visor.
"How you holding up, Cloud? You look a little shaky. I should have insisted you stay behind."
The clear worry made something warm in his chest, though the cold feeling of fear that came with the thought of being left behind quickly snuffed it out. In his mind, all he could see was the green-tinged memory of Zack walking away and never coming back. No, I'm fine. I'd rather be here. He'd have driven himself insane with worry, knowing Zack was out here with Sephiroth anyway, though a part of him wondered if it would have been better if he stayed. It was a part of him that was wondering what he should do now, what he should do about being in the past.
If you're sure,
Zack said after a long pause. Was he sure of anything anymore? He had no idea. Zack seemed to be asking all the hard questions today, he noted wryly, even though he had no idea he was doing so.
That's just Cloud for you.
A voice piped up from nearby. Cloud shot a glance at the slouched figure of one of the troopers he had no name for yet.
He's always like that about missions. Well, the ones I've been on with him anyway.
Cloud was struck once again by the uneasy feeling of not knowing someone who so obviously knew him. Zack held his hands up in surrender with a lazy grin.
All right then, just don't push yourself too hard.
Before he could say more, or Cloud could come up with another fumbled attempt to reassure him, Sephiroth called Zack's name.
Ah, well, it appears duty calls. Just remember, Cloud, speak up if you're starting to feel tired or something.
Cloud watched him trot back to Sephiroth's side numbly, wanting nothing more than to hurry after him, or call out for him to stay. The confusing mix of emotions brought up from last night was still choking him. Instead, he could only watch as Sephiroth turned on his heels and set off up the path behind him, and Zack fell into step with him. Zack turned back around, walking backwards and motioning for them to follow. The fingers he hadn't even realized he'd clenched on the rifle were beginning to ache. Cloud was half worried he'd damaged the weapon. He forced himself to relax his grip and check it over. Thankfully, it wasn't damaged. He might not have cared for the weapon, but it was better than having nothing. Cloud's head jerked up as someone called his name, and despite his unease, he forced his anxiety-stiff legs forward to fall into step beside another of the troopers. It seemed they already had a marching order, a rookie third at the front of their line, and the other taking up the rear, with the 4 troopers paired in between, and Sephiroth and Zack in the lead. Cloud looked ahead of him to where Sephiroth had crested a rise, Zack at his side. The sun was descending towards the horizon behind them, at just the right angle to glance off the man's silver hair and leave him in a disconcerting halo of light before he moved on. Cloud turned his attention back to where his feet were being placed and tried to keep his worries and fear from overwhelming him. He soon lost himself in the physical exertion of scrambling up the odd rockfalls and steep slopes. He stopped for a moment to readjust his grip on his rifle and looked back over his shoulder. The clouds in the distance were edged with yellow-gold sunlight from the slowly setting sun. The third who had been travelling behind him had stopped as well, and a look forward showed that the other troopers were staggering out along the rocky path. There still wasn't much, if any, chatter going on. The only sound, the troopers' harsh breathing as they paced themselves. The soldier thirds were having less problems, but still looked red-faced. Ahead of them, Zack appeared to be lost in thought again, and Cloud had no idea at all what Sephiroth was thinking. He hadn't really been paying enough attention to have a clear idea of how long they'd been on the move. It was obvious, though, that the regulars were in need of a break. Cloud gathered himself and said hesitantly, Sirs, how long are we going to be marching? He wasn't sure what the military protocol for these situations was, but Zack wouldn't let Sephiroth run the troopers into the ground if there were monsters at the end of the march. At least, he hoped Zack could do something about it. He had said if he was feeling tired. He couldn't help but feel guilty, like he was using his friend, though he knew that wasn't the case. But like with the orphans, Cloud was surprised to find a certain fondness for the group around him. Maybe it was just because he'd already defended them from monsters, or because they were the people he had the most contact with aside from Zack.
Cloud's right,
Gibbs said briskly, voice rough from the exercise. He turned his head around to give Cloud a brief nod of acknowledgement.
Sorry, sirs, but the troopers won't be able to keep this pace up for too much longer.
Zack came to a halt, perched on top of a boulder, and waved his arms briefly to regain his balance before he turned around to look at them. Even from this distance, Cloud could make out the sheepish look on his face as Zack ruffled his hair.
Whoa, sorry about that, guys. I guess we're all a little off today, aren't we?
Zack asked. He swung around to look towards Sephiroth, who had stopped a few paces further on.
We should probably stop for a while, Sephiroth.
Cloud tensed as Sephiroth turned and swept his gaze over them. The fact that he did not linger on Cloud was both aggravating and a relief. It was more baffling still when Sephiroth merely inclined his head in agreement, then turned and walked further away where he stood, his back to them. Zack gave a faint snort, drawing Cloud's attention back to him as he hopped down from his perch.
Go ahead and sit down. Try not to let your legs cramp up, because that really hurts. I suppose some of you thought to grab some rations for the rest of us, poor souls.
As the men threw themselves down in the dirt or plopped down on various rocks, Cloud couldn't help but think it startling how quickly his hesitant comment brought about a result. Jack was spread on his back, chest heaving as he gulped in air, his pack discarded carelessly at his side. Even Zack had made himself comfortable on the ground. Cloud felt foolish standing there.
Take a load off your feet, Cloud.
One of the troopers Cloud didn't have a name for yet piped up, gesturing with one hand for Cloud to sit down.
That pack must be killing you.
It had been part of the equipment Zack had shoved at him, though it had been such an insignificant weight that Cloud had barely noticed it. He hastily swung it off his shoulder and let it hit the dirt with a dusty thud. He wasn't sure of its contents, but neither he nor Zack had added anything to it, so he doubted there was anything edible in the general equipment.
Geez, take that helmet off too,
the trooper continued with a laugh, knocking his hand against his own helmet at his side.
You're making me hot just watching. You always do tend to wear that thing when you don't have to.
He was obviously the one Cloud should know, but the dark hair and tan skin didn't jog anything in his memory, no matter how hard he tried.
I hate these things,
the other nameless trooper said disgustedly, kicking his until it rolled into Jack's side. The prone trooper gave a grunt at the contact, but seemed content to leave it where it lay.
They're uncomfortable, hot, itchy, block your vision, and are a nuisance to keep track of. Plus, they make you look like a twit. They also keep your head in one piece if a monster decides to chow down on your ass,
Edge said, tossing a ration bar across to Zack, who caught it with a cheerful word of thanks.
That only happens if it mistakes your ass for your face, which is possible with you, eh, Sparrow?
Jack taunted, sitting up and grinning with the disgruntled trooper. Cloud made a mental note of the name, nearly up to date on his current companions. Zack paused in tearing open his food to remark,
My buddy Kunzel would swear by his helmet. I don't think he's ever taken the thing off. At least the soldier helmets look cool.
The still nameless trooper said wistfully.
Do they allow you to burn your old uniform when you join?
He passed a canteen to Gibbs with an expectant look.
Don't get your hopes up, Connolly,
Gibbs replied, taking a swig from the bottle and passing it to Cloud. He blinked at it, taking a hesitant sip before passing it on to Jack. He didn't feel dehydrated at all, nor even remotely tired, though it was probably best to seem as normal as possible, even though the grunts had apparently forgotten or were disregarding Sephiroth's presence. Cloud had not been able to relax with the man so near. It was getting frustrating, being so on edge yet being almost completely ignored. As the company settled in, Cloud listened with mild interest to their interactions. His ragtag group of friends weren't the most functional of teams, Cloud among the worst of them, with Vincent taking the prize, but even the more talkative of them never spent too much time teasing or chatting. Their mission had been too dire, their pasts too dark. The only time it had really been light-hearted was when Aerith was still alive. After her death, the spirit of the team had been sucked out. Shaking his head at his gloomy thoughts, Cloud glanced over at Zack to distract himself just in time to see him crane around to look towards Sephiroth.
Hey, Sephiroth, you just gonna stand there or what?
When Sephiroth failed to acknowledge him, Zack muttered,
I'll take that as a yes.
Cloud thought he heard Zack say something about Sephiroth being very good at holding up walls beneath his breath, and decided his friend's sense of humour was something he'd never quite understand. It wasn't long after that the troopers were rested enough to get moving again. Cloud had just finished shouldering his pack when he heard Zack calling Sephiroth's name again. For several seconds, it didn't seem as if Sephiroth was going to acknowledge Zack at all, and then he turned and swept his gaze over them again. Cloud tensed, every nerve standing on end, while the others seemed torn between jumping to attention and remaining as they were. Then Sephiroth turned that heavy gaze on him. It was piercing, even through Cloud's helmet, which he had failed to remove. It was a symbolic barrier between him and the silver-haired man, one he was loath to give up. Much like his time in Nibelheim, it was easier to hide behind the feature-concealing gear, to watch the world through the tinted shade of the visor. After several breathless seconds, Zack's voice broke through the rising cacophony of emotions and the pounding of blood in Cloud's ears.
We're ready to go when you are, Sephiroth.
Sephiroth inclined his head slightly and turned away without further word or acknowledgement. Cloud felt like he'd been struck in the chest by a behemoth, and he tried to hide his unease as they set off. The pace was less grueling than the previous workout, while still a ground-covering march. Cloud let his mind wander as the climb rolled past. To his surprise, no monsters attacked the group. When on foot especially, he'd been ambushed all the time back in the future, even on the relatively tame eastern continent they were on now. Perhaps with Jenova and Sephiroth's rise in power, the monsters had also multiplied, mutating out of the life stream. Or, he thought as the buzz from Jenova's cells peaked again when his gaze brushed over Sephiroth, perhaps they could sense the greater predator. Cloud tried to block the sensation again, even as he found himself hypersensitive to it. Usually it was his only warning for when Sephiroth was near. The sky was resplendent in deep oranges and golds by the time they reached the Mithril mines, having stopped only one other time along the way. As they had the last two times, the troopers immediately found spots on the ground to rest. The thirds waited for a nod from Zack before they joined the tired grunts, though none of them seemed to have the energy to strike up another conversation. Cloud sat down without prompting this time, sitting quietly among them, yet not really a part of them at the same time. He hadn't had a chance to talk to Zack, too nervous with the conflicting presence of the overly curious soldiers and the overpowering, intimidating aura that came from Sephiroth. Cloud was beginning to despair. At this rate, they'd make it back to Midgar, where Zack would leave for his own duties. After that, there was no telling when Cloud would be able to see his friend again, unless he waited for the ill-fated Nibelheim mission. That was if his meddling hadn't already irrevocably changed even that. Would it be better to let Zack continue with his life, unaware of the upcoming dangers? Would Cloud's presence in the army make any real difference, even if he managed to influence Sephiroth in any way? It was smarter, better, if Cloud left now, made his way to Nibelheim to at least eliminate Jenova from the equation. But there were too many risks. Hojo was still oozing around, and for all Cloud knew, Jenova might not be in the reactor at the moment. Hojo had moved the remains of her body to the facility in Midgar at one point, after all. Cloud resisted the urge to put his head in his hands. Life was never simple, even when you'd already lived it once before.
I will proceed,
Sephiroth said,
voice breaking the silence, and deal with the infestation. Continue on when you're ready.
Cloud's fingers ached from where he'd unconsciously clenched them in reaction to that smooth tone. Zack, who was currently looking at the rather haggard group, fists propped on his hips, nodded. Before Sephiroth could leave, though, he piped up.
What about the swamps?
Sephiroth was silent for a moment, before he nodded slightly.
I'll have the chocobos waiting.
And just like that, Sephiroth stepped forward and disappeared into the gathering dim of the cave mouth. Cloud watched, feeling oddly numb, as Zack pulled Buster's sword off his back and rolled his shoulders. A second later he looked towards Cloud, set Buster's sword down, propped against the rocks, and ambled towards him. His hand made an almost hollow thunk as it landed on top of Cloud's head. Cloud grimaced as the uncomfortable helmet was forced against his skull. Zack gave him a little shake, almost as if ruffling the hair he couldn't reach.
"Hey, how you holding up, Cloud?"
Now that the high tension of Sephiroth's presence and the hum of Genova was fading, he realized his shoulders were hunched and knotted up from the stress. Releasing a breath, he forced himself to relax at least a little bit, now that the biggest danger had left. He swiped Zack's hand off the top of his helmet and hooked his other hand underneath it to slide it off in one smooth movement. He let it go to drop carelessly on the ground as he ran a hand through his hair to spike it back into its normal style. Only then did he turn his gaze up to meet Zack's, hoping that the eye contact would reassure his friend where his words seemed to be lacking.
"I'm fine, Zack,"
he said, attempting a reassuring smile. It probably came out as more of a grimace than anything, since there had been so little for Cloud to smile at in the past few years.
"What are we going to do while we wait?"
he added, hoping that would distract Zack from asking too many awkward questions. Now might be his only chance to sneak away, if he wanted to head off to Nibelheim on his own. He had no idea how long it would be before they moved on, and there was still the problem of the presence of the other soldiers. He could evade Zack as much as the thought hurt. While he knew his friend was as persistent as a dog, Zack still had the others to worry about, and Cloud doubted he'd abandon them just to chase down one AWOL trooper. If Cloud waited until they reached Midgar, there was too many possibilities of being caught, between soldiers and Turks. Even the eyes and ears of the slum, Cloud would have a very hard time of getting away. It would probably be best, he decided, to try to take out Genova now, and leave his friend behind in relative safety. After that, he could return to Midgar to keep an eye on Sephiroth, even if it was at a distance. That would be the safest choice for everyone involved. Only Cloud would be at risk. Zack searched Cloud's face intently for several seconds, then nodded and gave Cloud a quick smile. The expression made something achy and guilty clench in Cloud's chest. Zack nodded again, as if reassuring himself as much as agreeing, and said,
"All right. I was just a little worried. You looked a little pale."
He reached out suddenly and laid the back of his hand against Cloud's forehead with an expression of mock concern.
"If I don't take good care of my first patient, the medical unit will never accept me."
There was a snorting laugh from one of the soldier thirds, and then,
"I don't think Lazard or any of the soldiers would let you retire to join the medics." "Yeah, no one cares about your sudden desire to be a nurse,"
the other third said glibly.
"I didn't need that mental image, Edge."
A sudden silence fell, during which Zack rocked back on his heels and landed in the dirt on his rear as he laughed. The awkwardness lasted a few seconds longer before Edge offered up an awkward sort of choke laugh.
"I'd make a terrible nurse anyway,"
Zack said at last. Cloud felt a bubble of bittersweet happiness in his stomach as he watched Zack's carefree mirth. It was amazing, having the opportunity to see his friend so lively and cheerful. That only made the pain of his decision all the more prominent. He'd have to leave now, or he'd chicken out and hide in Zack's protective personality again. This time from the outside, instead of stealing it for his own broken mind. Zack propelled himself smoothly back to his feet and stepped a few paces away, then turned on his heels and looked back down at Cloud with his hands propped on his hips.
"Anyway, what are we going to do while we wait?" "Why, wait, of course."
At the sound of a snore somewhere behind him,
"And nap," Sparrow said sweetly, "in the case of Sleeping Beauty here."
He nudged Jack with the toe of his boot. Zack turned again and wandered back to where he'd left Buster's sword.
"Let him sleep. I'd suggest you get some rest as well. We soldiers can go pretty well, but you troopers are probably getting run ragged."
He paused and ran a hand over the back of his head.
"Once we meet up with Sephiroth again, the rest of the way will be smoother."
Cloud remained silent as he sat and watched the others. Zack's orders were met with relief from the troopers, who didn't hesitate to join their fellow on the ground for the much-needed rest. Zack took up a position a little away from them with a half-hearted mutter about watch duty, for which Cloud was grateful. What he had planned was stupid and would be sure to bring attention to him immediately, but there was no other way to get away from the group. Even the rookies didn't look like they were doing more than relax, rather than drop into sleep like the troopers. Cloud's delivery service took him all over the world in the future. In a bid to remain gone as long as possible, he would wander, take longer routes, or sometimes pursue the occasional monster that had gotten too close to civilization. That meant he knew more local terrain better than anyone, and the cliffs by the mithril mines were no exception. The moment Cloud sensed Zack's attention turn away from them completely, he acted. With a sideways glance to make sure Gibbs and Ed were not looking in his direction, he gathered himself. There was a trick to moving faster than the senses could follow, one that Vincent was a master of. Possibly due to his Turk background, or just the natural grace his monsters provided him. There was only a puff of disturbed air left behind as Cloud leapt straight up. It only provided him a few seconds of grace time, Cloud knew. The rookie thirds might have noticed the power surge so near to them, but it would take them time before they thought to look up. Zack, however, was another thing altogether. Cloud didn't waste any time as he came to the apex of his jump. He kicked one foot lightly against the bulging side of the cliff wall, propelling himself further out of sight and away from the group. He landed amongst boulders and shrubbery in another puff of displaced dust. His legs burned from the sudden movement he'd been forcing them through. It seemed he wasn't as recovered as he thought from the overdose of Mako. No matter. There was no time to rest. Cloud took off running, sticking close to the cliff wall and the covering debris it provided. Once he was far enough away, he'd make his way back out from the cliffs and head back for Junon. He'd have to stow away on the ship again, or if he could pick up another helmet, maybe he could take place of another trooper on one of Shinra's cargo runs to Costa del Sol. Cloud was so focused on getting away that he almost ran straight into a fresh landslide. He cursed himself for having forgotten the very important fact that his knowledge of the terrain came from the future. Nature changed so radically in such a short time that he should have expected something like this to go wrong. Rather than risk slipping on the scree of the slide, or disturb it further by attempting to pass over it, Cloud cut sharply to the right. There was a steep downward slope here, and he had to be careful not to turn an ankle or hit any of the boulders strewn about in his reckless charge. He divided his attention between his footing and listening for the sounds of pursuit. Hopefully Zack was having a harder time traversing the obstacles of the rock face, since he'd have to keep an eye out for Cloud. The terrain ahead of him was flattening out, and from there on, Cloud would have a long sprint to get out of range of his friend's pursuit. Then, like a bolt out of the blue, Zack hit the ground dead ahead of him. Zack used a hand to catch his balance and turn around to face Cloud. His other hand was already on Buster Sword's hilt. In the next second, he had the sword in front of him. Cloud slid to a stop, kicking up a cloud of dust as his boots skidded on the ground in an attempt to stop his forward momentum. He gasped in some air, out of breath more from the stressful situation than the exercise. Somehow Zack's expression was far more threatening than staring at Buster Sword from the wrong end. Cloud had never, even when his friend had known he was going to his death, seen such a grim expression on Zack's face. He straightened slowly, taking a step back as Zack spoke.
I don't know what's going on, but you're not going anywhere until I do. I thought we were friends, Cloud, if that's even who you are.
Even his voice was different, low and dangerous, lacking any humor at all. His words caused a lump to form in Cloud's throat. They echoed another time, another fight with a dangerous madman. Cloud had parroted those words, stolen them as his own for a time. Friend. Cloud had no weapon on him. The standard issue gun had been left behind, being more a hindrance to him than anything. Even if he'd had first Tsurugi at his side, Cloud wouldn't have made a move to draw it. Fighting against Sephiroth, despite the admiration Cloud once had for the man, had been hard enough. He'd had the dubious bonus of being the victim to Sephiroth's madness and hatred, before he'd ever had to raise a sword against him. With Zack, Cloud wouldn't be able to defend himself, even if the world went to hell because of it. It would be too much for Cloud to sacrifice to fight his friend. "Zack," he said, trailing off since he had no idea where to start. Could he convince Zack to let him go, to forget about Cloud and just go back to his men? The thought was ridiculous. Zack didn't bow down once he had a goal set in his mind. Maybe the Mako was still affecting his senses. That could be the only reason he tried to turn tail and run. All Cloud could think about now was trying to get away, find some way to leave his friend behind without having to put Zack at risk. From Sephiroth or himself, he didn't know. He barely registered the sound of Buster's sword hitting the ground behind him. Zack hit his back before he'd taken more than a handful of steps. Cloud couldn't even cough as dust clogged his throat, his breath having been driven right out of him when Zack had tackled him down. In seconds, Zack used his knees to pin Cloud's legs, straddling his back and pinning his arms to the rocky ground with his hands. He should have expected something like that. Zack was a soldier first, a real one, unlike Cloud. Now he was well and truly trapped under his possibly former friend. It was only a small mercy that Zack hadn't brought the Buster sword against him.
"You're not," Zack rasped, "going anywhere, Cloud."
His breathing was heavy above Cloud, almost panting from exertion and maybe emotion. He bucked futilely against Zack's grip, not in any real attempt to get away, but more as an effort to get some air back in his lungs.
"We're going to have a little chat."
Zack's voice in his ear was harsh and too close, and Cloud couldn't get away from the accusing tone in it.
"Are you a Wutai spy? How about working for Genesis? Did Angeal do something to you? Or is there something else going on, Cloud? Are you in some sort of trouble? Because I'm not stupid no matter what they say. You stood up to Sephiroth, and those moves just now. Even I can put 2 and 2 together and get 4. Who are you? And what are you trying to accomplish?"
The barrage of questions only baffled him, names he couldn't remember flying through the air without meaning. The heart of it, however, was that Zack thought he wasn't Cloud, or that something horrible had happened to him. "Zack, please, let go of me," he wheezed, mind panicking at being restrained. It reminded him too much of being under Sephiroth's control, where he had no control over his limbs. He'd nearly killed Aerith with his own hands because of that. Now Zack was here, confusing the issue, thinking that Cloud was a danger that needed to be subdued. He probably was. He couldn't help but think bitterly. "Just forget about me, please," he whispered, closing his eyes tightly as memories threatened to overwhelm him. It was at times like this that Aerith would appear next to him, always just out of sight, but with a word of comfort and strength. There was nothing now. Cloud was alone, pinned to the dusty ground by a man he would have given the world to see again, and there was nowhere else to run.
"Cloud,"
Zack said. He sounded tired.
"I can't do that. You've made yourself pretty unforgettable."
The joke was weak at best, but still made Cloud feel uncomfortable and desolate. "Cloud, talk to me, buddy." It was too much. Zack's final plea, nearly unheard in the dry, empty air, drove right into Cloud's heart. What good was he to his friends if he was causing them this much pain? Tears of frustration prickled at the corner of his eyes. Why was he balking so much? "I can't," he said, the words sounding pitiful even in his own ears. Cloud hadn't learned anything. He still tried to run away from people who only wanted to help him. Tifa would have been disappointed if she knew how much of a coward he was being. He swallowed hard, gathering every scrap of willpower in him, pulling up even the straggling remnants of Zack's personality that had been such a shield to him when his memories had only caused him pain. "If I promise not to run, can I at least stop eating sand?" He knew that was more of a Zack voice than his own, but there was no way Cloud would be able to handle this situation. There was a long pause, and then Zack said,
All right, I'll let you up. But if you try to make a run for it again, I'll find a way to tie you down if I have to. When I let you up, we're going to sit down and talk this out. I already told you that I have your back, and I meant it, Cloud. You can trust me, whatever it is. Whatever trouble you're in, I'll help any way I can. Promise.
It said a lot that Cloud wasn't surprised when Zack let him up without protest. He ignored the threat as useless, since he'd already decided he wouldn't run anymore. It didn't matter if the promise had yet to be made in this time. He'd promised Tifa he'd try to be better. And if Cloud could find a way to do that with anyone, it would be Zack. He gently pushed himself to a sitting position, legs splayed beneath him as he rubbed his wrists distractedly. Zack hadn't been gentle, but it was a minor ache that was already going away. Zack would help him, could help him. He had to keep telling himself that, even with his friend's promises ringing in his ear, Zack would believe him if Cloud told him everything. Right? Aerith, her flowers are beautiful, don't you think? He said quietly, breaking the tense silence. He couldn't bring himself to look at Zack as he kept his gaze firmly on the ground, though his eyes were unfocused, not seeing anything here or now. They're like sunshine growing from the ground. And they're tough. I fell on them once, right through the roof. A couple got bent, but they were okay. Aerith told me I reminded her of someone who could only have been you, Zack. Cloud took a deep breath, knowing that this would be the hardest part of all. He looked up, catching Zack's gaze with his own, and prayed his friend would believe him. But you were already dead by then. Cloud couldn't control a flinch as Zack let out an explosive breath and let himself fall back into the dirt, arms spread and legs stretched out. After a long time, Zack slowly said, as if testing the words, "What are you trying to say, Cloud? Take pity on me and be a little clearer, would you?" Cloud let out a shaky breath, made up partly of relief and lingering fear. At least Zack hadn't tackled him again, intent on bundling Cloud off to the nearest medical center for a clear case of insanity. That was positive, right? Best to pick a spot and start somewhere before he lost his nerve. "It's hard to explain," he began, then gave a half-hearted self-deprecating laugh. "Well, obviously it is." That sounded dangerously like Cloud as Zack, and he had to pause again to get his thoughts under control. All he needed was to be even more confusing with his mood swings. As far as I can tell, I was sent back to the past." He looked up quickly, holding up a hand to forestall any comment from Zack, who had indeed opened his mouth to comment, but politely held it back. He appeared to be regaining some of his usual energy, and had an expression of impatient waiting on his face. "I know that sounds odd, and I'm not really sure myself. I fell into the Mako, in the reactor in Nibelheim, and then came up here, with you." He trailed off again, shaking his head in frustration. "I don't know, Zack. How do I even start explaining?" Almost as soon as Cloud stopped talking, Zack picked up the slack. "Okay," he said, drawing out the word. "Time travel. All right, let's go with that. How far in the future did you come back from?" Cloud began to laugh. It was really too much, but Zack hadn't even hesitated before firing off his question, as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world. I don't know," he gasped between chuckles, bending over as his breath came shorter. He knew it was a hysterical reaction to the stress, and fought for control. "I don't know," he repeated, inhaling deeply and choking back further laughter. "I can't remember much before. At least 8 years, I think." Zack nodded, and Cloud could hear his hair grating against the dirt below his head. A moment later, Zack gave him a slight chuckle as well. They probably looked like a couple of beat-up loons. Then Zack reached out and yanked Cloud's arm out from under him. Cloud allowed the momentum to roll him over, so he was on his back as well, head close to Zach's. Zach murmured,
"There, that's better."
Then he said,
8 years is a long time.
There was a pause, and Zach seemed unsure about what he was going to say next, but he said it anyway.
"You don't remember much?"
Cloud's mirth disappeared entirely at the innocent-sounding query, but he knew he'd have to explain it all at some point. From the moment Zach had caught up to him, perhaps even the moment Cloud had arrived in the past, it had been inevitable. It's probably best to start at Nibelheim. It's the last place, the earliest I can remember, sort of. He stared sightlessly into the empty sky above. I was a trooper assigned to accompany you and Sephiroth on a routine check to the Nibelheim reactor. Something went very wrong there. The town, my hometown, was burned to the ground, everyone slaughtered. He said hollowly. The first time he'd told the story of that day, he'd still thought he was Zack, or at least the soldier first persona he'd created using his friend's memories. The buffer had allowed him to be angry more than hurt by the recollection. Now, though, with Zack's breathing in his ear, it was so much harder to relate. It was Sephiroth. He'd gone mad. Due to Genova, I think, but we never did find out. Not really. He thought she was his mother, and that Genova was an ancient. That humanity was a blight on the planet he needed to exterminate. Zack frowned, face thoughtful and serious. Genova, he murmured, then repeated the name a few more times. I don't know why, but that name sounds familiar. I swear I heard it somewhere before. He gave a little wry smile, apparently giving up on the thought. I don't. He turned his head to look more fully at Cloud again. What do you mean, earliest you can remember? Like amnesia or something? It was an odd thing to focus on, though Cloud couldn't blame him from shying away from the darker issue. Still, he shook his head to the query. Not amnesia. This wasn't the first time I was exposed to Mako. Cloud swallowed roughly. He'd fallen victim to the planet's livestream too many times. Even when he'd given in to the green-driven madness, his memories had never been fully recovered. Tifa had done what she could, but there was a time after he'd left her behind in Nibelheim, and before the train station in Midgar, that Cloud had pushed aside in favor of his stolen memories from Zack. What he couldn't explain away with his false claim as first, he blocked thoroughly, and never in his delusion thought to question the gaps in his life. Zack grimaced.
You got hit with the rough side effects? How much do you...
It's... Cloud winced, then let out a humorless laugh.
Which time?
I forgot myself for a long time. After he betrayed his friends and the world, begged a madman for a number and a purpose, after he didn't deserve to be rescued from the prison of his broken mind. There's a few memories, but mostly I only remember Nibelheim and after. I meant, Zack's face screwed up in obvious bafflement.
You mean you don't remember Modierheim, Genesis, Angeal, Hollander? None of that? It doesn't ring a bell?
Cloud made an aggravated sound in the back of his throat. Dear, I don't remember any of that. It's frustrating, but after Nibelheim, Hojo... He choked on the bile rising in his throat. It was amazing how much Zack's personality had buffered him all that time. It was like all his memories had been seen through a window instead of happening to himself, which, he supposed, had been the point. But now he could remember all the pain, all the terror, all the helplessness, and all the hatred he had for the scientist. After Sephiroth was defeated in Nibelheim, Professor Hojo captured you and me, he said, fumbling a hand over to where he knew Zack's arm was. He needed the reassurance that his friend was still alive and well,
Recounting the past like this was making it seem all too real, and the idea of his friend fading away like a dream was terrifying. He did a lot of Mako experiments, among others. A lot of what I remember before that is just gone, or secondhand. Zack sat up suddenly, and a second later his fist slammed into the dirt. "Damn it!" he snarled. "Damn it! And I bet Shinra just reported us all as killed in action, too." Cloud jumped at Zack's sudden movement and loud exclamation. It didn't fit with his memories of a smooth voice and always smiling face, but Cloud couldn't really blame Zack for the outburst. All things considered, it was amazing he was still as calm and rational as he was. "Genesis Rhapsodus and Angeal Hewley," Zack said slowly, voice smooth and toneless. "We're Sephiroth's best friends. Only friends, really, I guess. During the mission to Mediaheim about a year ago, I met you. We joked about being country boys together. You were the only one capable of keeping up with me." Zack tilted his head back, looking up to the deepening hue in the sky. "We found Genesis hiding out there, and I fought him. He plummeted to his death. Then I went after you. You chased after Hollander, but Angeal took you and Sang out before he followed Hollander himself. I followed them." Cloud sat up slowly, listening as Zack explained in a clipped voice about things he'd forgotten. As the words washed over him, glimpses of memories flashed by. A dark-haired man with a buster sword, who Cloud could have assumed was Zack, but for the feeling that it wasn't. Another man in a long, red coat, with a cat's paw expression on his face. The explanation didn't suddenly unlock a hidden part of him, but Cloud felt better just with the small knowledge he gained, especially of when it was he'd met Zack. It had bothered him on occasion that all he remembered of Zack was their time in Nibelheim and afterwards. The attachment he'd felt for the man who'd sacrificed his existence for Cloud's was so deep that Cloud felt he must have known him long before then. The fact that Zack had only known him a presumably short period of time made the sacrifice all the more poignant and heartbreaking, though. Zack could have, should have just gone back to Aerith and left Cloud behind, but he hadn't. "Angeal made me fight him," Zack said slowly. "I won, and he gave me his sword." There was a sort of self-loathing in his voice right then that Cloud had heard often enough in others, in Vincent's, in Barracks, and most often in his own. The man had been the original owner of the sword Cloud had set up as a memorial for Zack. Now Cloud knew that it was a symbol for two great men who died too soon. Anyone Zack cherished so much would have been a good person. "I don't know anything about your past before that. I'm sorry." Cloud barely heard those last words as he silently watched Zack heft himself to his feet and wander over to gather the large blade from where it had been abandoned. Zack lifted it up, gripped in his hands, then bowed his head to rest against the flat of the blade, as if in prayer for a long moment. Then with a sudden, jarring motion, Zack put the sword in place on his back and turned to look at Cloud. "So," Zack said, "what do you plan to do about all this? Being here, having to face your past again." Sucking in an unsteady breath, Cloud rubbed his hands across his weary eyes. The worn leather of his gloves pulled at his hair, but he paid the minor discomfort no mind. Dropping his hands in his lap, he stared at them as he considered the question. What was he planning on doing? There was no plan. He hadn't wanted to be here. Never asked for, dreamed a chance like this was possible. Forgiveness had been hard enough for Cloud to find, in himself most of all. Now everything he'd fought for was gone. His friends, the meager family he had brought together, the peace he had suffered so much for, were all gone, and there was no way he could ever get them back. No matter how much he wished for what he'd lost, Cloud couldn't allow history to repeat itself, not when the cost was so high. He looked up at Zack, just tracing over the familiar features on his friend's face.
This wasn't something he could lose. Not again.
I have to stop Sephiroth. Somehow.
He trailed off and turned away, unable to hold Zack's gaze. That was the key. Maybe it hadn't started out that way, but Cloud knew that the silver-haired man was the biggest threat to the future he wanted to see unfold, one that would be better for everyone. Zack crossed his arms over his chest, head bowed.
If it's possible,
he said, forming every word carefully.
If there's any possibility.
He shook his head and looked back up at Cloud, expression slightly fierce.
We have to save him. Maybe that's not the right word for it. I don't know. But I can't just stand by and let another person I care about turn into a monster and not...
Zack choked, and the fierce look melted away into a self-deprecating smile.
Look, my track record with helping people isn't too great. So maybe if we work together we can manage it. What do you think?
Cloud stared at him blankly as he turned the request around in his head. He'd had the thought already, but to hear it out loud made it real in a way that terrified him. What if Sephiroth couldn't be saved, and Zack died again because of it? He said, mouth dry. He swallowed, working up some moisture to soothe the parched tissue. I can't say for sure if it's possible. Sephiroth... He trailed off, staring at his own hands blankly, as if they could provide him with a solution. I can't remember ever seeing Sephiroth so human as he is now. But he must have been. I admired him, wanted to be in Soldier to be like him. To save him would be beyond belief. He ran a hand into his hair, clutching hard as memories of cat-like green eyes and a taunting mouth tried to overwhelm him.
But I hate him, Zack. I really, really do. I was just a puppet to him, a plaything, and I was forced to betray my friends, the world. I nearly killed Aerith with my own hands because of him.
His voice was rising into hysteria, and he could do nothing to stop it. I had to watch as he killed Aerith. The words rang harshly in the sudden silence, and Cloud wished he could take them back. Zack reeled back a step, as if the words had hit him like a physical blow. He reached up, fingers finding his own hair in an odd mirror of Cloud's own motion. Aerith. The betrayed, strained look on Zack's face morphed immediately into a stony look.
If it comes to it, I'll fight Sephiroth to the bitter end, and kill him if I have to. But until then, there's no going back. I'm not giving up.
You don't think I tried? Cloud asked numbly. This was all wrong. Zack wasn't supposed to look as haunted as he did. Zack was supposed to be happy. He was a soldier, respected and strong. He had Aerith to return to. He wasn't supposed to sound broken, but the strength of will, the burning determination to finish it one way or another, that was pure Zack. That was what had carried them both across 2 continents, despite being hunted like animals. The words were said in ignorance, though, of what Sephiroth was really capable of.
You didn't fight Sephiroth at Nibelheim. You lost.
He'd cut down Tifa, but she was alive, and I was by her side. You asked me to stop Sephiroth. I did it. I managed to drop him into the Mako, but Sephiroth had got me with his sword. He trailed off, shaking his head.
Do you know how many times I've been struck through by it?
He waved a hand, dismissing the arbitrary comment.
I don't know if I can do it again. Go through all of that again, if we fail to stop him first.
Zack waved it all off with a motion of his hands.
Yeah, but I wasn't forewarned then, was I? This time I know that I need to be ready, so I can work even harder to be ready. And I don't know if you realize this, Cloud,
he said,
and now that amused smile was back. But you're no regular trooper this time. Zack strode forward and crouched down in front of him, reaching out, and placed a hand on Cloud's shoulder. He squeezed lightly. You and me, we're going to change things. I just know it, so no looking down and disheartened. We can do this between us. I know we can. After all, I'm going to be a hero someday. You won't have to go through that again, he said, conviction heavy in his voice as he reiterated, as if it would make it more true and make fate play like he wanted. We'll make sure of it. But we have to try, Cloud. Sephiroth, I don't know if he'll turn out the way you remember or not, but right now he isn't that person. Cloud clasped one hand over Zack's, holding it tight against his shoulder. There was one thing he had to make plain to his friend, above everything else. Even if the world went to hell again, Zack couldn't let himself think he was a failure. Not like Cloud. You were a hero, Zack, he said earnestly. You saved me, and even after you were gone, you protected me when I couldn't go on. It should have been you who lived. Zack would have done a better job. He wouldn't have had to hide behind false memories, not being able to see the truth until it was too late. Sephiroth would have had no hold over Zack, and Cloud knew his friend would have done everything he could to save Aerith, where Cloud had been helpless to act. What happened to me, Cloud? It felt like Zack had slapped him. If there was anything Cloud didn't want to tell Zack, it was that. But Zack had a right to know. He had believed Cloud's wild tale without a moment's pause, and had already decided that he'd stick by Cloud despite the possible future that awaited him. Wouldn't it be better if he were prepared for everything? It didn't make it much easier, but in another way, it was a relief to actually speak the words out loud to someone. You... He started softly, forcing himself to speak. Died defending me. He stopped, taking a deep breath, gathering himself. Zack had asked it, so Cloud would tell him. He kept his gaze locked with Zack's, drawing in strength from the other man, and continued in a nearly emotionless voice. After Sephiroth was defeated in Nibelheim, you and I were badly injured. Professor Hojo found us there. He was upset that I had managed to defeat his perfect creation, and also curious. He took both of us away. It was years before you managed to break us out of there. I was too out of it from Mako poisoning. It was thought I wouldn't recover. You tried to get us to Midgar. I remember you said it then too, that we were friends. Then Cloud's voice was shaking now. He'd never had to recount the story out loud, never had to relive it as more than a half-forgotten memory in his mind. Now he was able to recall the hazy, green-tinged images, the smell of blood and dirt, the feeling of the cold rain biting through his delirium and pain. Sometimes I could hear things, and I knew where I was even if I couldn't move my body. And one time, I heard so much fighting and gunshots. When it was over, I waited, but you didn't come back. I found you dying. There were so many bodies. You'd taken down an entire army before they'd managed to get you. You gave me the sword. I remember that, just before. He couldn't continue, aware that he had tears trailing down his face. And then he'd forgotten his friend, wrapped himself so deeply in Zack's memories that he'd taken his place. How could he have repaid his friend like that? Zack should hate him, and yet Zack had come when Cloud was on the verge of defeat, offered him again, affirmed their friendship, and Cloud's place as his living legacy. Cloud could remember Zack's expression,
and the gesture as he turned away to follow Aerith back into the life stream. Zack hadn't hated him. Cloud was sure of it. Now all he could hope for was that Zack would forgive him here and now as well. Zack moved his arm from Cloud's shoulder to grip the back of his neck and pulled Cloud towards him. The embrace was awkward and wonderful. Cloud was not used to affectionate gestures, but he'd rather live branded a weakling than end the contact with Zack. The memories were still raw on his nerves, yet Cloud felt oddly relieved. Finally, he was able to let go just a little bit, relate a bit of the pain with someone who would understand his feelings behind the actions. "I'd do it again," Zack said roughly. "It sounds like he was a real hero. I hope I can live up to that." "I'm glad you're here, Zack," he said hoarsely into the other man's shoulder. Even if he didn't have his other friends by his side, he still had Zack, who had sacrificed himself to save a nobody he barely knew. Zack gave even Cloud's hopeless quest a new hope, one that Cloud could believe in. "I told you that I've got your back," Zack repeated. He carefully held Cloud away from him, a hand on either shoulder, and searched his face. "I'll do my best to keep you in one piece, as long as you promise to work with me and let me help so I can. I don't really want to die. I've got promises to keep." He grinned crookedly, but there was obvious exhaustion in the gesture. "So what do you say, Cloud? Partners?" Zack stood up, sunlight glinting off his shoulder armor and buster sword where the hilt peeked over his shoulder, then extended his hand to Cloud. Silhouetted in the golden light of sunset, Zack looked both ethereal and more human than ever, and Cloud couldn't help but stare. It might have seemed like nothing but an offer to help him up, but Cloud couldn't help but think of it as so much more. As he reached up and clasped Zack's hand, all he could remember were the outstretched hands of his friends, of Aerith, and even Zack as he pulled him free of the Mako. There was so much in that single gesture. "Yeah," he said, voice rough from his breakdown, and from the emotion settled in his chest right then. A simple offer to help him stand in more ways than one. But Zack's smile was warm and jubilant, even if Cloud was avoiding looking at him directly. It was embarrassing having broken down in front of his friend, even if Zack didn't think any less of him for it. "Then it's agreed," Zack said, and Cloud nodded, finally looking up to meet his gaze. After another beat or two, where Zack considered him quietly, he slowly asked, "About Sephiroth? I realize you probably don't want to hear this, but he's my friend too, so could you at least try? For me?" Cloud freed his hand from Zack's grip and scrubbed at his face to remove the traces of tears as he considered Zack's plea. There wasn't really a choice here either. Cloud had decided that he would do anything he could for Zack, in appreciation for the life he was allowed to live. If that meant risking it all over again to save the life of a friend, then it was the least Cloud could do. "I'll do it," he said simply. There was no more chances after this. Either the world would be saved, and Sephiroth along with it, or Cloud would die and take the madman down with him. Zack grinned, thankful and bright. "Let's get back then. We still have our ways to go before we get back to Midgar." Cloud gladly accepted the offer and followed after his friend without a word, too spent and emotionally exhausted to respond. The hike back up the slope was a little slower, as both of them were feeling the exhaustion and emotional toll of the last day or so. Zack kept up a quiet line of inane chatter which helped keep Cloud's mind off the painful things they talked about, though he couldn't help but wonder at the fact that Zack had seemed to accept everything so easily. A part of him worried Zack was just humoring him. When they crested the last rise towards the entrance of the mines, a voice called, "There they are! Finally!" Zack lifted his head to wave to the trooper, who was hailing them in the last. fading vestiges of daylight.
Hey guys, sorry that took so long. Cloud was still a bit restless from that Mako bath he inadvertently took, so we worked it off on some monsters in the area.
Once they were back on solid ground, Cloud ducked his head and hurriedly went to collect his gear. Behind him, he heard Zack say,
"Let's not tell Sephiroth about this. Ever. And maybe we could keep quiet about Cloud attacking Sephiroth. I don't think Cloud needs that kind of attention right now. Right, buddy?"
The company chorused a round of
"Yes, sir!"
in response, and Cloud wondered if any of them thought the request odd. Zack clapped his hands in a businesslike manner.
"All right then, let's see if we can get through the mines before we decide to bed down for the night."
Looking at his friend and thinking over the situation, Cloud couldn't help but feel a little bit lighter.